Everybody, welcome to Stay in Your Lane. I'm your host, John Maley. Today we have a very special guest with us. Robert Costello happens to be the Chief Economist and Senior Vice President of International Trade Policy and Cross-Border Operations with the American Trucking Association. Thank you, Bob, for being on and participating.
Thanks, John. And is that title long enough for you? I
I,
wasn't
I
sure.
had to follow it. I had it all written
You
down.
know,
It's a lot.
it's a lot, let me tell you. It's a mouthful.
That's something. Can you get all that on a business card?
I don't know. Well, yeah, I guess they did, but just happy to be here. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. I don't think there's a lot to talk about these days in the freight market, is there? I mean, it's pretty boring,
Uh,
but I'm sure we'll figure something out to talk about.
Definitely. I noticed for the first 3 months of the year, supply chains, all you saw at 6 a.m., noon, 5 and 6 p.m., and all evening long in the news, and all of a sudden it's disappeared.
So, well, first of all, I do think, and you probably get this in your own job, right? You go out to, I don't know, party neighborhood stuff, and people are like, oh, what do you do? And you're like, I work at the American Trucking Associations. Oh, I've been, during the pandemic, they're like, I've been hearing all about this supply chain stuff, right? I mean, that never happened before. They'd be like, trucking, what's trucking? What's that all about, right? And so, I do think it brought a good spotlight to generally during the pandemic of supply chains and everything going on. In terms of recently, yeah, news cycles, on and off, and maybe, the first quarter wasn't, it was okay, right? I mean, the first quarter wasn't bad, but it wasn't as tight, and I suspect that was part of it. And last fall, it was pretty tight. So I suspect the way the news cycles work, and they've kind of moved on to other things in the industry, right? I'm doing now a bunch of diesel fuel price interviews with media. So you're right. I mean, I think maybe the supply chain stuff has eased a little bit, but the fact that we were getting the kind of media attention that we were is I think really is not a bad thing overall. It may not be for the best reasons, right? But people start to understand when they go to the store, and maybe there's some bare shelves, why that is, and so forth. So, but we did get a lot of media attention generally since the pandemic.
Oh, definitely. For us, it's our everyday, and for everybody else in the world that's outside of supply chain or transportation or trucking, it's not an issue until it's not at the store or we can't get it, right? So you'll learn a different lifestyle, and the buying habits change, the markets change. Just like people aren't going out and spending money like they were eating out at restaurants all the time because they learned through the pandemic. You know what? We can have good quality time and eat good at home, and spend the time together. Whereas I think everybody was in the hustle and bustle of the regular day to day before the pandemic. So it's different. I think from our side, we look to you to have that crystal ball. For many years, uh, we look for you to be our direction in a lot of respects. So thank you for participating again, and I'd love to know your take on the last year or so and the past 90 days. Maybe we'll start there if you can share
Yeah,
some information.
yeah. So, I mean, 2021 was just a killer of a year. I mean, it was a banner year. If you look at GDP numbers, I mean, we had 3 quarters. GDP grew over at least 6.3%, and went up to 6.9% in the fourth quarter. I mean, this is an economy that in normal times grows 2%. And why did we get such high growth? Well, some of the stuff you were talking about earlier, you were switched around what we were buying. We were, buying a lot more goods and services, and that certainly helped the trucking industry. But we pumped a heck of a lot of money into this economy. And so in the long term, just two things determine the economic growth of any economy: population growth and productivity growth. And when you still look at those two items today, we're still a 2% economy, maybe a hair less than that. And that's what we're, so last year was very strong. And then if you look at the drivers of truck freight, I mean, one of the things that I look at, real, so already adjusted for inflation, that simply means personal consumption of goods, right? So no services, just goods. That's what we're moving around in the supply chain. That went up over 12.1% last year. I mean, unheard of kind of numbers. Um, Housing starts were the best year since 2006. Manufacturing growth was solid despite all the supply chain problems. It was up, over 6%. So when you add it all up, and those are really the sort of drivers of truck freight in a very general sense, you add it all up and it was a banner year. Now, where are we in the last 90 days? Where are we going this year? Well, we're going back down for the economy and really for trucking. We're going to sort of we're going to go back to that long run steady state, right? So we're transitioning back to a 2% economy in the first quarter. Actually, GDP actually contracted 1.4%. But if you take out a drain down on inventories, right, and some of that was because we weren't getting everything we could from other economies, and then also then the trade situation. Anyways, you take out those two sort of outliers, we grew 2.6%. So you don't obviously do that, but my point is, it wasn't as bad as the top line number seems, and I think that's going to be true for the freight economy this year as well, right? Slower growth, or even in particular, I'm thinking of inflation adjusted consumption of goods that may even fall a little bit, but it'll be the second highest levels ever, and not far off of last year. So even with the Federal Reserve getting ready to increase interest rates even more. So listen, I'm not a doom and gloom guy for this year. Do we have to all understand it'll be slower than last year? Absolutely, right? I mean, we are transitioning back to a slower environment, but I don't think it's off of a cliff either.
Okay. So, you know, I think from our perspective, we've seen the pendulum swing in our industry. I've been in this 28 years. You've been doing this a very long time. We all know that things are going to be different now for the rest of this year, we anticipate. The question that I think most of us have is, you're saying it's not doom and gloom. It's going to be second to last year. It's going to be down some. Interest rates are going up. What do you see as an impact overall, though, in our industry? I think the biggest issue we have is attaining growth in equipment and drivers capacity. How does this impact that from your perspective?
Yeah, I do think that capacity, probably the situation gets a little bit better, but it's still going to be relatively tight. For one reason is getting new trucks this year is going to still remain a big challenge. OEMs are already backing off. They after the first quarter, they're like, listen, we're probably not going to be able to build as many as we thought earlier in the year. We're still having supply chain problems with our suppliers. That some of that is semiconductors, but it's more than that. So I still think that getting new equipment is going to be difficult this year. Probably, hopefully, a little bit better than last year, but still not to where we need it to be. And that's going to impact supply, and really it's a headwind for supply, right? I mean, it means that these fleets can't get all the equipment they want, and then on top of that, you got the drivers. Listen, there's some evidence that we are adding some drivers to the industry. I'm getting ready actually to go and speak to some truck driver training schools, and I think they're doing a good job. I think we talked about the media earlier. All of the media attention around drivers and pay going up substantially. I mean, we know from history that helps, and that's why we do it, right? And that's why I spend a lot of my time doing media interviews, because it highlights it for people that are like, wow, maybe I'll be a truck driver. Maybe that sounds like a profession for me. So there is some evidence that we are getting drivers, even in the long haul market, which is where the big problem is. Local drivers, local drivers are at almost the highest about the highest they've ever been in terms of the numbers of local drivers, which also screams to me lifestyle for drivers, right? I mean, it's
Correct.
that over the road thing. But I will say this, while there's some evidence that we are getting some more drivers, more than we had here through the pandemic, we're still not back in that sector, that long haul sector. We're not back to the level of drivers that we had prior to the pandemic. So we still are digging out of that hole. And it's come at I don't, I always like, how do I phrase this stuff? When it comes at a big cost, I don't mean that in a negative sense. Listen, the market is what the market is, right? And drivers, when the demand for drivers far exceeds the supply of drivers, what happens to price? It goes up. And so we're seeing average weekly earnings go up at 4.5 times their weekly earnings, or their historical average. I'm sorry. So the weekly earnings is going up 4.5 times the historical average. And it's
What does that number look like, Bob?
So that number, you're now up in the mid 60s for all drivers. So, mid 60, low, it's 63, 64,000, 65,000 a year when you annualize it, somewhere in there. So, and by the way, we're doing a big driver compensation study soon here at ATA. So we should have some more data on that in the not too distant future. But so we're getting some folks in that long haul market. But again, you're now seeing, here's the interesting thing. Inflation's going up so much. Almost most occupations, their pay, while going up a lot more than it has historically, is not keeping up with inflation. Truck driver pay is. It's one of the few occupations that is keeping up with inflation. It doesn't mean they're beating inflation, but they're right around 8.1, 8.2% year over year growth. And even a little bit higher than that in some recent months.
Well, I think that's going to be needed. I think the toughest sector for us to fill is the over-the-road spot. The regional jobs are more desirable for the drivers because of lifestyle, and being home for a family and things of that nature. And the wife works in most of those scenarios too. The over-the-road driver is the toughest spot to fill. So when we see last year in 21 capacity overall go down maybe 1% in the big number, but 5 to 10% of those take other opportunities running regional or local or e-commerce runs that are shorter haul, and they're home more, and they're able to generate more revenue. What we're wondering is what's the impact going to be long term if the market and the prices come down to a point where it stops people from getting into the truck for the long haul job.
Listen to the second half of this podcast available now at TTTransport.com/podcast.